The Gonzaga Socratic Club has addressed the problem of evil on, I believe, 2 or 3 other prior occasions, and it is among the most interest-producing topics that we cover at the Socratic Club. Everyone is aware of the challenge of the phenomenon of evil and how it provides a provocative challenge to theism. How do we make compatible the presence and reality of evil with the notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God? So that's our topic for today. This is the Gonzaga Socratic Club. The Socratic Club is inspired by the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by the famous Christian apologist and literary scholar C.S. Lewis during the 1940s and 50s. The Socratic Club took as its motto to follow the argument wherever it leads, especially concerning matters of theism and Christian faith, Christian doctrine, and Christian practice. And like the Oxford Socratic Club, our approach here is to address philosophically questions that concern Christians and those who are curious about Christianity. So, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming. Our topic today, as I've already indicated, is the problem of evil. Everyone's aware of evil. Everyone understands that evil is a challenge to the notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. And we want to try to make some progress on understanding what the challenge is and what responses might be offered to that. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Collender. He has taught philosophy courses here, but he's currently teaching in the School of Professional Studies courses on normative and applied ethics, leadership, and systems theory. He has a long interest in questions of theism and philosophy, and received his PhD a couple of years ago now?
I think it's about 4.
4 years ago, okay. From the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And he's been teaching here on and off, I didn't say that at the beginning, but he's been teaching on and off in various capacities here at Gonzaga for about 10 years. So, if you would, welcome our speaker, Dr. Michael Collender.
Well, it really is a joy to be here with you, having the chance to talk about such an important topic, and I'm amazed just to see all of you students here. Also, some people from the community who I know, who attend either my church or also just schools locally, but also to see faculty members who are interested in this topic. It's wonderful for us all to be able to be together, both within the Gonzaga community and people joining us from the outside, to consider this important topic. I want to also thank you, David, for not only hosting the Gonzaga Socratic Club and leading this, but also providing this venue where we can talk about so many different important topics. And also, I'd like to thank my colleague, Richard McClellan, who has graciously come to give the response to my talk. We met earlier this week, and I basically gave him my talk and my argument. I have no idea what he's going to say particularly, but I'm very excited to hear it. And a number of times, I've actually sought Richard's advice on just a number of different matters, and so it's wonderful to have you respond. Today we're talking about evil and the question of God. Evil and the question of God, and I need to figure out how to advance this. So, we're talking about evil and the question of God. And to begin this discussion, it's important for us to consider experience, our own personal experience of evil, and how we define evil. Usually these sorts of talks begin with someone giving this long, horrendous description of some experienced evil in the world. I'm not going to do that. And the reason why I'm not is that I trust that all of us in our own lives have experienced evil in some way. There are so many things in this particular world that we live in that are just horrendous evils. And they can be extreme, what we might call extreme moral evil, like what we saw with Nazi Germany. But also, there are personal evils, betrayal, frankly, having your parents split up, the sufferings that come along with broken relationships, people that you trusted. And so instead of belaboring the point with giving you this description of all of these various stories, I trust that this topic just inherently is something that resonates with us. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're all here, is personally we do want answers regarding the nature of evil. I'm not here to pontificate as though I have all the answers and as though I'm going to answer for you individually why you have suffering. And I don't want to cheapen the Christian tradition by trying to present the case that way. But I do think there is an important way in which we can interact with the question of evil, and a way that will shed light on our human experience and frankly shed light on our own suffering, that sheds light on my suffering. So continuing on. First, there are two kinds of evil, two major kinds of evil that philosophers talk about. The first is natural evil. Natural evil. There are obviously many kinds of natural evils. Most recently, a horrendous example of natural evil with the tsunamis that swept through Japan, but certainly there are many other kinds of natural evil. Even in the ancient world, one can think of the city of Pompeii that was buried by ash. They didn't know this was going to happen, this volcano was going to erupt, but then the next day they are buried with ash. And because of that, we now know that the city of Pompeii was a giant porn exhibit, basically, that would make Hugh Hefner blush. It was just a horrendous place of rampant illicit sexual practices. And it got buried for us, and now we know. Now we know that it was that sort of a place. But we wouldn't know it if it were not for that natural evil which occurred to it. Now we might think, oh, that's sort of a comical type of natural evil. But while there is a kind of silliness in one aspect of that example, I suggest to you that there are many other types of natural evil that in no way can we look at easily with a sort of eye toward, now why is it that this happened? So that's natural evil, but there's also moral evil. Moral evil. And I think this is the one that is particularly difficult for us to engage with, in that moral evil is something that we cause. Right? It's something that humans perpetrate on other human beings. And from the Christian tradition, we want to say that God is in control of this, that God is in control of human actions, or at least is able to stop them. So moral evil has a secondary effect as well, which is that it separates us from each other. Faith is something that is social, and I would define faith as believing based on testimony, believing or giving mental assent to something based on testimony. But when we have evil in our community, then what ends up happening is that we lose the opportunity, the easy ability to believe others. And we end up living in a world in which we're alone. And I think many of us have had this experience of being alone, and for those of us who've experienced severe betrayal, there is a sense of being terribly alone. And it becomes very difficult to trust the hands that deal that blow to us. But also, I think it's very important for us to grapple with this problem of evil, because as a community, we aim to bring about justice to others. Our university, in our own mission statement, talks about the goal of social justice. I know that's a politically loaded term, so let me define it in the terms that the late Paul Ricoeur uses to refer to the importance of understanding justice within institutions. That justice practiced by human beings requires us to think in a social way, where we realize that we live life on life, and when we pursue evil, the effect of that is that it ends up hurting other people. If any of you have had parents who've chosen to seek out evil, you know that the result of that comes back on you. You know that you have to suffer for that. We don't live as little isolated people. And oftentimes when we think in terms of the problem of evil, we tend to think about maximizing our own benefit. But one of the things I'm going to do as I'm talking about this is to also talk about evil in terms of it relating to a community and how a community interacts to bring about an end to evil. And I think this is one of the most important things in the biblical tradition talking about evil. There is a diligent pursuit in the biblical tradition, especially in the Old Testament law, regarding producing a just civilization and the penalties that come on us by our own hands when we choose to leave that direction. We think we're going to get a benefit for ourselves, but the effect of it is that everybody pays the price for the sin that we're pursuing. Okay. Not only is there the element of social justice, but also as part of our mission statement is this idea of being inspired by Christ being at work in the world. And I think we see if evil is in the world, and if there's just no sense to it, and evil is just perpetrated, then I think you immediately can see the problem of seeing and being inspired by the vision of Christ being at work in the world. Because Christ isn't at work in the world. It's just stuff happening, and you can be subject to evil and have extreme suffering. There's no sense to it. And I suggest to you that because of this very institution that we're a part of, the question of the problem of evil and how the Christian tradition addresses it is very, very important. So I'd like to look at three different versions of the problem of evil. First is the logical problem of evil. The logical problem of evil, which looks for a contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil. And you probably have heard this in your classes, so I'll go through it quickly. First, God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. God is all good, which means that God would want to get rid of evil, but evil exists. So therefore, God must not exist. I think you can see, obviously, the point being made by the problem is that either we have evil in this world, or we have God. Now, there's a solution that's been presented to this that's basically swept academic philosophy, and it's planning as free will defense. Alvin Plantinga makes the argument that if, in fact, there is evil, and if, in fact, there is a good reason for having it, then God isn't just simply perpetrating evil on us, but rather the reason why the evil exists is for a greater good. And Plantinga makes the argument that greater good that justifies the existence of evil is allowing humans to have free will. That because we have freedom of choice, because we have the opportunity to choose according to our nature, because we have the opportunity to choose according to our nature, that is a good reason for allowing evil. Because that means we have the freedom to choose it, right? Well, because of Plantinga's free will defense, and the fact that this possibility exists such that it closes down the argument, the literature has shifted over to an evidential problem of evil, and an existential problem of evil. The evidential form of the problem of evil explains the problem of evil more in terms of probabilities. Okay? Instead of talking about these attributes and trying to find a logical contradiction, Instead, the argument is made in terms of probable proof. And this evidential problem of evil, the form in which it's stated, it's presented in order to question and or reject theism based on, or on the basis of, I think that is actually how it's worded in the text, based on the basis of moral protest, indignation, and outrage at the evils of this world. So we experience these evils and we tell ourselves, look, you know, I don't care about the various categories. I'm experiencing evil and it hurts. And I wonder, why is it that God would allow this? Why would God allow me to be in this situation? And so, in this problem of evil, the question is the distribution. Why is it that I'm experiencing this? Or why is it that the Jews are experiencing this in World War II? Why is it that evil gets shifted around the way that it does? Why is it that we take money in this country, we take money from this country from poor people, and we give it as aid to rich people in poor countries? Why does that happen? If God is just, why isn't there just distribution of these things? Why doesn't the world work better? And within this problem, we find the definition of gratuitous evil, and there are a number of different definitions of gratuitous evil. So I'm actually using the one here that Richard McClellan gave me in our conversation, which is evil is gratuitous if the sufferer doesn't get anything out of it. Okay, in this definition, the Christian hell is gratuitous evil, because there's no redemption coming from it. And then the next one is, why me? Right, the existential problem of evil. Why do I have this red car here? Because this reminded me of this red CRX that I had back in a number of years ago, and I was driving to college late at night, and I was coming around this turn, and it was icy, and I slipped, and I wrecked my beautiful red CRX. And not to my credit, I got out of the car. I was so angry. And I looked up at the sky. I'm so ashamed of this. And I shouted out, "Why?" That is the existential problem of evil. Now, obviously, there are more extreme versions of this rather than losing your favorite car. But it's been encapsulated there briefly. Christ himself endured all three of these. If you think about the problems that Christ faced, clearly he faced the logical problem of evil. How can a good God allow these things? He faced the evidential problem of evil. He lived at a time that was so incredibly corrupt and unjust. In fact, in our discussion, we may actually get into this a little bit. But I mean, I could spend the whole, for the next 2 hours, I could just, story after story, we could go on about how unjust the times were in which he lived. The oppression, the oppression of religious leaders. It was a terrible time politically. And he also faced the existential problem of evil. He read his own Bible, and his Bible told him that he had to die for the sins of the world. Imagine if you were reading your Bible, and you're doing your Bible study and just reading it carefully, and you figure out that in fact, because of the genealogy and who your parents are, that in fact you are the one who's been descended from David. You can go back in your records, because they kept these genealogical records all over the Roman world. You could find out that in fact you were the one who was descended. And you realize that this is my calling, right? You read Daniel, you read all these books, you put the story together, and you figure out what the destiny of the Messiah is. That's what your loving Father intended for you. I mean, if there's an existential problem of evil greater than that, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it would be. Christ faced them all, but by facing them all, within the Christian tradition, somehow he ends up saving us all. What separates his way of thinking about each one of these problems from the way that we tend to think about these problems? And I suggest to you the answer to this is incredibly important if we desire to pursue the mission that is the mission of this university. And I don't mean just for the purpose of serving our university. Because one of the reasons why we're here is we believe that this mission is part of a greater mission that involves loving the whole world and serving others and bringing an end to evil. How do we participate in that? What did he know that if we knew, we could do what he did? In the middle of the darkness, we can think accurately and make the choices necessary to redeem our world, or at least bring the redemption to this world that has already been brought forward. Well, first, I want to talk about the problem with the problem of evil, and I'm going to start with the definition of evil. And this will be the point that I'm going to come back to again and again, probably during our discussion, is the problem of defining evil. The problem of defining evil. If you read David Hume's dialogues on his dialogues regarding religion, one of the points that he comes back to in talking about evil is this question of how much evil, or how much suffering actually is evil. And he makes the point that regarding evil, all of us have a sense of when is too much. Right? When is too much? Well, I think you all can see from that, there's the problem of, well, who gets to decide what's too much? What's too much pain? If in fact, pain, mere pain is the definition of suffering, that makes, or excuse me, mere pain is the definition of evil, reaching a certain level, then that means that the definition of evil is ultimately subjective. I felt too much pain, therefore it's evil. I don't like that because I think it's important to be able to point out evil and say, that's evil! That is evil! That is morally wrong. It's not a personal preference. It's not that I'm not tough enough. There actually are real evils in this world that are separate from my own judgment on how evil they are. Well, we can also define it as purposeless suffering. Evil is purposeless suffering. But I want you to notice that even in defining evil as purposeless suffering, I have to be able to look into a moment of suffering, a moment of pain, and be able to understand its purpose totally and completely to make that argument. Right? Well, I have to ask the question then, whose story am I using to interpret that pain? Suppose I have pain with my tooth, right? Incredible pain, and this man comes and drills into my mouth, and it hurts. But then I find out that that is in fact to save my tooth. I end up looking at that evil much differently than I would have otherwise. The story is part of what allows us to understand what is actually evil and what isn't. At least if we wanted to define evil in terms of purposeless suffering. There's a story related to it. Also, this definition of gratuitous evil. Gratuitous evil, as we looked at before. I want you to notice that even in defining gratuitous evil as evil that is not redemptive, okay, evil in which there's no beneficial, supposedly no beneficial outcome, there still is a matter of a definition that has been stipulated. Well, the question comes, whose definition are we using? Whose standard are we using to measure evil? Is it one that we as humans just came up with? Did we invent evil? Am I just making up this idea and then pointing at God and saying, you don't exist because I made up this idea? Why don't I just make up the idea that God doesn't exist and just cut out the middle? Look back at the definition of the evidential problem of evil, which I have posted right here. Notice the basis for the evidential problem. On the basis of moral protest. It is morally wrong for God to allow evil in this world like this. It is morally wrong. Do you hear the standard being applied? Whose morals? Whose morals? I think it's morally wrong for God to not allow me to have a job, or for God not to permit me to have a job where I make $100,000 a year. I think that's morally wrong. God, you can't do that. I'm making $90,000. That's just not fair. Actually, I don't make $90,000. I make much less than that. But all the more, how dare God have me make so little money, right? What's the standard? Okay, indignation. If I'm going to have wrath because I haven't received something, on what basis do I deserve that thing? Okay? And moral outrage, it's the same point. But now, going down here, notice this. It's outrage to the evils of this world. The evils of this world. Which means that I have to say that the evils actually exist. It's not okay for me to say, look, we have this human world where we just come up with definitions and it's all human knowledge and it's a human idea of God and so on and so forth. And then to say, therefore there actually is real evil and therefore an actual real God does not exist. You can't do that. If, in fact, there is such a thing as evil, then it has to objectively exist so that you can then wad it up in a ball and throw it at God. There has to be a real evil. Well, can I, on the basis of my own inventions, invent some definition of evil such that this evil now really exists so that I can really disprove the existence of God? I suggest to you that even in posing the problem of evil, we know, those who are posing it, in some sense, are having to know or at least fictively rely on there being some sort of standard that is greater than just our own opinions. Where does that standard come from? I suggest to you, if we're creating an argument where evil is being thrown at God, what would God say in reply? Well, God is the measure of good, the standard by which good is measured. And in fact, this is the testimony throughout the Bible if the problem of evil is being used against Christian theism. That God himself is the standard. There's a famous argument in a dialogue by Plato called Euthyphro, where he asks the question, is holiness holy because God looked at it and thought it was holy, therefore the standard is outside of him? Or is the standard something that God chose and therefore it's arbitrary? Well, the Christian tradition has answered that the Euthyphro dilemma is actually wrong. It's not one or the other. In fact, rather, it's the character of God. The character of God is the measure for good. Now, if humanity created the standards of morality, if these standards are the only measure for what is and is not evil, then the definition of evil ultimately is subjective, and beyond human opinions, evil does not exist. Therefore, atheologians cannot claim that objective evil exists. Thus, I want you to notice this. Thus, the problem of evil in all three versions cannot work without the kind of moral standard that God provides. Okay? If you were going to say, I'm so angry because there's real evil in this world, you have to answer the question, what measures it beyond yourself and beyond your community and your friends who get together and decide, yeah, I don't like that. You not like that? Yeah, I don't like that. You have to have a better, more robust definition. And this is what we see articulated in the Christian worldview. But the next, I should have solution part two. The best of all possible worlds. There's this famous book by, why is it that his name is suddenly slipping my mind? Voltaire, where he, in Candide, he ridicules the idea of the best of all possible worlds. This Christian notion of the best of all possible worlds. He says, look at this world. We all suffer, right? That's what I began with. We've all experienced suffering. Some of us rather extreme suffering. Well, why is it that we would be experiencing this suffering? Obviously, it's ludicrous to think that this is the best of all possible worlds. And I am going to agree with his assessment. I think it is ludicrous to think that this is the best of all possible worlds. When we look at this world, there are plenty of things that are screwed up. And there are some people who try to solve this by saying, look, God doesn't know. He just doesn't know. You know, World Trade Center, God was surprised. I mean, he saw those planes and he thought they're taking off going this direction and then, no, they're turning around toward the tower. Oh no! And free will, I can't do anything about it. The planes, right? Well, I suggest to you that it just doesn't work to say God doesn't know about these things. He knows. Does God have enough power to stop him? Yes. He does. So if he knows, then he's not stopping him. There has to be something else going on. And I suggest to you that if you hold on to either one of those two views, the problem that you're going to have is catastrophic. So to save time, I'm not going to read these passages to you, but jot this down. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and the book of Romans chapter 8. This particular problem is all over the Bible. Okay, the problem of within this world, there are so many different evil things that happen. How do we grapple with that? Ecclesiastes chapter 3. You've ever heard that song? To every and a time for every purpose. Have you ever heard it? Wow, I'm dating myself. That's like from the 60s. There's this famous song from the 60s that takes this passage from Ecclesiastes where it says, you probably have heard this before, there's a time to be born, a time to die, right? A time to make war, a time for peace, a time for mourning, and a time for dancing. That famous poem is bracketed with this idea, it's right there in the text, that God makes everything beautiful in its time. God makes everything beautiful in its time. And this is a very hard idea. A very hard idea. But what it's saying is that in the scope of history, within this story that God is writing, there are these events which occur where there is a time for war and a time for peace. And people are making these decisions. And if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it's very frank about the oppression in this world, about the darkness in this world. It's very frank about that. But what it also says is that in the midst of this, God is, if I can use the analogy, making this story. That he's writing this story, and people are characters in it. They're making authentic choices, real choices. But because God knows the end from the beginning, he knows where this is going. And in the end of all things, God actually is going to judge the world on this particular view. You may not agree with this per se, but it says this at the end of Ecclesiastes. And the reason why is that the author of Ecclesiastes recognizes this problem. And in the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 8, where Paul is articulating this famous verse, this famous point that God works all things together for those who know and love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. Have you ever had somebody tell you that God works everything out for good? Right? You ever heard that idea? God works everything out for good. In the context of that, Paul makes reference to this particular passage in Ecclesiastes. And he uses the Greek word to describe the futility of this world. It's the Greek word that translates the Hebrew word that talks about how the world is futile in Ecclesiastes. Paul has in his mind this very same passage, and what he says is that in fact God is going to take suffering, human suffering, and redeem it. That in the end, there actually is a purpose for it. But here's the catch. You can choose to make your suffering non-redemptive. You can choose that. You can choose to say, I don't care. I think you're wrong. I'm going to interpret this a totally different way. I reject the way that you're working out the world to bring good to this world. And on this note, the reason why I've got this picture here is I want you to think of this for a moment. Following this story that I just told you, it's like God is building this giant, huge church. This is a picture of St. Al's. Okay? God's building this church. But all of us, we're beetles. Beetles. Do you think a beetle, imagining this, if you were a beetle, could you study St. Al's and explain its beauty if you're a beetle? Would you be able to figure it out? You could be a very smart beetle and think very rationally, but St. Al's is big. And there are lots of little relationships that you have to figure out. And this is the challenge that comes when we try to explain any individual's personal suffering, that this story that's being told is a huge story. Do I know all of the various different relationships between the things that I'm doing and the things that other people are doing? I suggest to you that now we do because we have Facebook. Well, but even with Facebook, right, all the data that Facebook gives, do you think that's enough to explain all of the various different relationships? Do you think Mark Zuckerberg can even understand all these things? Okay. Now, I return to Gonzaga's mission. Okay, and the bigger mission that this mission is a part of. That if we're going to pursue justice in this world, and we're going to see Christ at work in this world, then we have to see this world with the right story. We have to see it in the way that it's being governed. Remember how I mentioned at the beginning that faith is belief or assent based on testimony. There are many things that we, whose testimony we trust. We trust the testimony of our eyes, right? Prove to me that your eyes are giving you reliable information without using your eyes. Right? You trust the testimony of your eyes. Prove to me that your mind testifies to you reliably without using your mind. Because you have to first prove that your mind is reliable before you can use it. This is the idea of evidentialism. You have to prove something before you have to use it. If we have that mindset, do you notice how all knowledge just shuts down? You can't know anything. Well, if I want to know about God, how am I going to do that? Well, what if he gives me testimony? Can't I approach his testimony the same way that I approach my eyes? That I approach my own reason? I suggest to you that the story that's being made may be much bigger than even what we could think of with the analogy with St. Al's and Beale. Okay? If there is this great story that is being told, all right, and this is actually what the Christian tradition describes, then we have a choice. Which narrative we're going to look at the world from. And when we start saying that things don't have a purpose, we have to go back and ask the question, what's the standard? How do I know? What's my standard by which I make these moral judgments? And I conclude with a prophet, one of our own, Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a famous atheist, and he proves my point. He says, describing the universe, that at bottom there is no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I want you to notice that if Richard Dawkins is correct, and his worldview is correct, there is no problem of evil. Because there is no evil. There is no evil. So when we suffer pain, when I suffer pain, this is something that greatly encourages me that the very fact that there is evil in this world is testimony that there's a good God and that evil one day will end.
Practice of the Gonzaga Socratic Club to promote discussion by having a respondent. Our respondent today, as Dr. Collender has already mentioned, is Dr. McClellan of the Philosophy Department. Dr. McClellan.
Large audience. My thanks to both Michael and David for inviting me to respond to Michael's talk. Appreciate the opportunity. I should say by way of full disclosure that I'm not a theist and neither am I an atheist. I think both the theists and the atheists are entirely too confident of their positions. The problem of evil is, of course, an ancient one, and it is often one of the more pressing ones. That is, it is frequently one very common reason why people do not embrace theism in any of its traditional forms, or in its major traditions. There's quite a few things that I'm sure we'll want to pick up in discussion from Michael's talk. Here are a few things that I would like to respond to. It is, I think, true that what used to be known as the logical form of the problem of evil has been pretty decisively answered. And the proposal that classical theism contains an implicit contradiction in the face of the reality of evil or suffering has largely gone by the wayside among philosophers of religion. The evidential problem has indeed taken the center of that particular stage, especially in recent years. I myself am very impressed with the various forms of the free will defense that have been offered to answer the logical problem, and I think they're entirely adequate to that purpose. Moreover, Dr. Collender is quite right that the evidential form of the problem is usually a probabilistic argument. That is, it's not the claim that theism could not possibly be true, but that theism is unlikely to be true. And there are various ways in which that claim can be cast, depending on what kind of approach to probability you wish to use. Moreover, he's also quite correct that it's customary to think about evil or suffering as that which may be caused by natural events or that which may be caused by moral agents such as ourselves. And it is often one form which we find particularly disturbing. Unlike Dr. Collender, I find much more disturbing natural evil than I do moral evil. Perhaps because I am desperately wicked and thus know what it is like to do things deliberately that are evil by intention. That is, I know it from the inside, as it were. Whereas I haven't the foggiest idea what to make out of earthquakes, volcanoes, terrible diseases, and the like of that. I don't know what it's like to be a bat, and I don't know what it's like to be a virus. But I do know what it's like to be a moral agent. Moreover, I'm familiar with the experience, which I'm sure you are as well, of having done things for good reasons and good intentions that turned out badly, either for myself or someone else. Or am I the only one here who's had that experience? And this is often deeply perplexing to us, of course. But I think much more commonly, the fate of poor victims of Pompeii is a much more baffling kind of event. It is this bafflement which I think people often find central to the evidential problem of evil. That is, the search for intelligibility of what would make good sense out of various kinds of suffering. One way to put the issue between the theist and the theist's opponents, whether atheistic or agnostic, as the case may be, is to say something like this: there are many things in this world which are expectable or intelligible if theism is true. Consciousness, for example, the appearance of morality, especially common morality among and across many human cultures. The appearance of intelligence, the appearance of compassion, of empathic concern, and the like. These are intelligible and expectable if classical theism is true. If naturalism is true, widespread, apparently inexplicable, and badly distributed from the point of view of the sufferer at least, suffering is explicable and expectable. What disturbs some people is that such widespread, apparently unintelligible, inexplicable, or unjust suffering does not appear to be expectable if theism is true. There are various ways of making out why one might have those kinds of expectations, and they can deliver different versions of the problem. Now, in terms of responding to this kind of objection, I do think that Dr. Collender has hit on some possibilities which could be exploited very far. Let me begin with a few of his comments which I think won't go very far. I don't think it's the case that when we're talking about suffering or evil, that just because we use human concepts or human ideas, that we are somehow reduced to subjective judgments or merely subjective judgments. Human beings don't have any other concepts to use except those that belong to human beings. But it doesn't follow from this that they are merely subjective or somehow privately arrived at. In fact, the vast majority of human concepts we hold in common. And most of the concepts we use do indeed correspond to reality in the world. So I don't think that proponents of the evidential form of the problem of evil or suffering, just because they use concepts that are familiar to them or common to other human beings, are somehow reduced to subjectivity in that regard. The appeal to testimony is a worthy maneuver, but I submit to you that relying upon God's testimony, especially in the same way in which we rely upon our senses, is first of all to beg the question that is at issue, which is whether there is indeed such a God at all. Moreover, the reliability of our senses has overwhelming support in our experience, whereas the content, interpretation, or truth of any alleged divine testimony does not have such overwhelming evidential support. You support the reliability of your senses every time you walk successfully across a room, pick up a cup of coffee without spilling it, and the like of that. No alleged divine testimony has anything like the same evidential support. I think this is a parallel that won't stand up to an examination. What I do find attractive is the answer that Job got, and it's also the answer that Jesus got, which was silence. Job also got, as part of his answer, the claim that he was epistemically unfit, rather like the Beatles and St. Al's, to understand a proper answer to the question of why it was that he had suffered so badly and what was the explanation for his suffering. And he gets carried through a long litany of where were you when I made the heavens and the earth, and what are you to comprehend these things. Now, the notion that we are somehow epistemically so far away from God and God's purposes that we could not understand them were they revealed to us is, I think, actually a very promising step. Because it may then be plausible to suggest that while much suffering is apparently pointless, it is not actually pointless, but that the point could not be made clear or intelligible to the sufferer, only to the divine being whose purpose it is. However, this will carry other consequences which we may wish to explore in discussion or conversation, which I think will perhaps not serve the purpose of the theist as well as one might wish. It remains, I think, possible to answer the evidential form of the problem of evil, but the task is a large one because it means trying to suggest that there can be reasons, morally sufficient reasons, for perfectly horrible forms of suffering to occur. Horrible forms of suffering which, without begging the question, we have no good reason to think the sufferer could ever understand or comprehend. Substituting better reasons for those is a task, and I think it's a very large task for the theist, but perhaps we could, as I suggest, make some distance towards doing so in discussion. Thank you very much.
Let me just jot a couple notes here. Well, I'd like to begin by first thanking Dr. McClellan for his response. And this is in fact one of the reasons why I wanted to present this, is that I wanted to hear Dr. McClellan's response as I'm thinking through this argument. I knew that he would bring it strong, which is the reason why I shared with him my argument before I came and presented it to you all. But I'm very excited at this point to have the chance to reply. If you recall in the explanation of his reply to what I said, notice first of all that he distinguished between what we would expect in a theistic world and what we would expect in an atheistic world. Okay? I want to encourage you to think in terms of these stories, these two different stories. Dr. McClellan has chosen the easy road by saying simply, I want to not necessarily assume a number of categories. I want to not commit to either side. I want to be indifferent. I want to be, we might even call it agnostic, though I don't know if that's necessarily the term that he would want to use. I think the term that we've used in our conversations with a non-theist.
I have no objection to agnostic. I'm not indifferent.
Okay, all right.
I would object to that.
So given that situation, what I want you to do as you listen to everything that Dr. McClellan says, is I want you to ask yourself, why? How does he know that? Why are his moral judgments necessarily the right ones? Why is it that he can talk about moral standards? Why is it that he can talk about there being evil in such a way that violates moral standards? If, in fact, the community of people that gather together have some sort of consensus on what, in fact, is morality, why is it that there have been so many people throughout the history of the world who have gotten into their own little groups and decided that they could come up with their own little morality and oppress people and murder Jews and murder gypsies and homosexuals, just that's what they wanted to do. On what basis did they go ahead and do what they did? Okay. So we have to go back to the question of morality. We have to go back to the question of morality and standards. Okay, next. Regarding human judgments and being subjective, the statement regarding these judgments being subjective, that is the word that I use, and I stand by it. I think it's accurate. But it's also correct, and we understand this in our postmodern world, that we can talk in terms, and culturally people talk this way, about standards being subjective, but yet groups hold them. Groups hold them. So we can have community-based standards that we hold as true because a certain community embraces them. But what that's doing is taking the same problem and expanding it to a group of people. Now what happens when we have one community and they disagree with another? Also, regarding God's testimony, Dr. McClellan described the problem of walking from one side of the room to another. And that as you walk across the room, you get the opportunity to test your eyes. You get to look and then test, look and then test. Like, do you bump into things? Okay. Well, I suggest to you, if I might make this analogy, that I can do the same sort of thing if I start out in Egypt. And God says, why don't you go this direction? And I have this pillar of fire, and I want you to follow this pillar. And then I follow him, and I learn, well, let me just go ahead and walk my own way. And I see what happens because of that. Over time, I learned that, in fact, God does provide for me. He sends manna from heaven. And then I go into the land, and I find out that, in fact, when I go into this land, that God is faithful in all of his promises, unless I choose to head a completely different direction morally, at which time he also keeps his promises, which is that this is what will happen to you. You will become a people that is not socially just. You will end up oppressing yourselves. You will end up running into all different kinds of problems. That through this walk through a room, which is a much larger room, I can come to learn the reliability of my eyes. Why can't we use the same sort of epistemology in a different context? And in fact, I suggest to you that this actually happened. That as a cultural memory, as we individually might walk across a room and remember the experience, in terms of this people's cultural memory, they were so, they had discovered through their senses that this tradition was so reliable, that this knowledge about God was so reliable, that in 70 AD, there was actually a group of different groups of people that decided that they were going to try to make a claim through military conquest to these particular promises of God. And you had three different factions, each with different leaders, who decided, I'm going to be the Messiah, and I'm going to kill all the other people who disagree with me being the Messiah. And the reason why they did this, I actually had this conversation with Jonathan Price, who's the leading scholar on the history of Jerusalem related to this event in the world, at the University of Tel Aviv. What actually happened at that time is that these three factions fought each other inside Jerusalem because they believed, they were so convinced, because they knew their history, because they had the historical records and whatnot, that God would act in history. And so they were fighting each other because they wanted to be king of the hill when God came down to deliver Jerusalem. So they didn't really fight the Romans, they just fought each other. To the extent that they pressed famine on the city, they butchered each other by Levitical standards, the entire city was unclean. And what ended up happening eventually? Well, Rome took the city and destroyed it. And it created a crisis of faith in that particular narrative for the particular defenders of the city who decided they were going to stand and fight with this particular Messiah, or this particular Messiah, or I'm going to murder based on what this person is doing. And I suggest to you that the reason why they did that is because they had the testimony of their senses, but they chose to misinterpret them. Okay? They chose to actually misinterpret them, which for them was going against, at least for this particular group of people who were fighting in this particular city, okay, they were going against their particular tradition. All right? And what ended up happening, I would argue, is that those people who pursued peace, who pursued the peace that is taught in Scripture, whether they were Jewish or Christian, were the people who were delivered from that particular situation. They weren't inside that city and they weren't massacred. Okay? They trusted their eyes, following our analogy, and they didn't give up their eyes at the end. And then finally, I have more to say regarding the tradition regarding Job and Jesus, but I also don't want to hog the floor. So in the discussion, if one of you wants to raise that question or is interested in it, I'd like to follow up with that. So, Dr. McDonald.
No, that's all right. I think we should open it up. Anything else? Questions or comments?
Yes.
Am I understanding you correctly, Dr. Collender, when you say that ethical categories, especially like good and evil, especially evil, only makes sense if you believe in God?
No, I'm not going to say that they only make sense if you believe in God. I'm going to say that they make, I would argue that they make sense because of God. There's a difference. That I think, and you see this all throughout the Bible, in fact, that people who do not adopt the Judeo-Christian tradition oftentimes act more morally than those who are in that tradition. An excellent example of this, if you're interested, is the book of Jonah. In the book of Jonah, you have this prophet who is running from the call that God has given to him, which is to go and preach to Nineveh so that they can repent, because God is showing mercy to the Assyrians. This particular person does not want mercy to go to the Assyrians, so he hides in a boat and tries to run from actually having mercy be brought to these people. Well, what ends up happening in that story is that all of the Gentiles, the people who are not part of the Jewish covenant, they actually end up trying to protect Jonah, trying to save his life. They pray to their gods for him. They do everything possible to not throw Jonah off the boat. And I would suggest to you, you see this again and again throughout the Bible, you see it in the testimony of Jesus, that people can understand morality without, and ethics and good and evil, without direct reference to God. But the reason why they can, according to Scripture, is that they're created in His image. Even if they reject that, they suppress that.
What does that mean, created in His image?
Created in His image, they're created to recognize, to be able to understand good and evil, to think rationally.
So we can recognize good and evil because we can recognize good and evil.
We can recognize good and evil because, well, what I'm doing is I'm giving you one aspect of the definition. if you perform as I'm defining, I'm giving you a metonymy, where I'm giving you a list of parts that identify the whole. You can't say that because I'm listing a bunch of parts that a thing is only its parts. So if I define a bird as a feathered biped, and you then, or if I were to say it's a biped, then you were to say, well, it's just a bunch of feet, it's just a couple feet. Well, that's not how definitions work. So by me itemizing the parts, I'm not saying that a thing is only parts. Did you have a follow-up? I think you're asking good questions.
Yeah, and I don't want to ask too many of them. But it does seem interesting to me that my ability to call out moral evil, I'm not quite sure how that depends on God per se.
That's a great way that you phrased that question. What I'm doing is I'm pushing you back, or not you per person, but all of us. I'm encouraging all of us to ask, why do we think these things are so? So if my reason for defining evil is just my brain coming up with standards or us getting together and defining them, my question is, why should we trust that definition, us getting together and pooling our ignorance, or me individually sharing with you my ignorance? Why is it that that is more reliable than God coming to us and telling us directly, communicating with us, telling us his moral law, sharing with us what a just community would look like, how we can love one another? Why is it that we trust ourselves rather than letting him share his testimony with us?
Are you a divine command theorist?
No, I'm not a divine command theorist, and I would argue that divine command theory is actually a slander against the view of basing morality based on God's character. I'm not saying that...
Let's not go too far away from the issue, though. The issue was the problem of evil.
But I think his question is a legitimate one when we start to ask regarding how is it that we know that if God's character is the standard for morality, we need to have a way of understanding God's character. And I suggest to you that in his kindness, he gave us a way to do that.
But look, the problem doesn't get on the table if one presumes the existence of God, because the existence of God is the issue of the argument. One cannot merely presume an answer to that question, because otherwise the argument doesn't get off the ground.
Well, likewise, if I presume that God doesn't exist,
one need make no such presumption. Just avoid the presumption of answering the question in the affirmative. Because, after all, if we know that the answer to the question is affirmative, we know that, then there's no point in discussing the issue about evil or suffering.
but when
Right.
I just... Oh, go ahead.
Now, I mean, this may be your point. That is, it may be your point or your view that the problem is somehow a pseudo-problem, that it's a kind of faux problem of some kind.
And I would argue that I do think it is a sort of faux problem.
Well,
A sort of faux problem.
then, of course, if that's the case, then neither of us has much to say to the other.
Well, we have two different frameworks with which we're approaching this problem. There are different assumptions, and it's very important for us to ask the question of why one framework is more reliable than the other. And what I'm doing in the way that I've structured this problem, the way that I've structured my reply to the problem, is I'm showing a need for the ability to define evil.
Yeah,
For
well,
the
that's not a
problem to
problem.
even work,
And that really isn't a problem, because we
Well, I would argue that
we
it
could
is.
reach agreement on that, I think, without any difficulty at all. We could select out, we could do it right here. We could find 5 or 6 prime cases that all of us would agree were at least apparently pointless suffering. Gross, grotesque, and apparently pointless suffering. And then we could say, well, let evil be anything that is sufficiently similar to those. Why wouldn't that do it?
Well, the very beginning of the statement is the non-starter. If we get together and ask ourselves, what are some examples of evil, and we agree on that, then we take that definition and we apply it to the problem of evil, and we say, see, we've got it. I'm asking,
No.
I'm
There's
asking,
nothing like
where do
that.
we go back? Well, but I'm asking us to go back and ask that first fundamental question. Where do we get those moral standards from, such that we can say that this thing out here which really exists is in fact evil, and thus the existence of that real thing that's evil disproves the existence of it being real.
I'll pull a John Locke on you. We get it where we get most of our knowledge, that is from experience. And we are, after all, well adapted by our long evolutionary history to be fairly accurate recorders of our experience.
He would not have made that second
Perceptual
move.
memory.
Because he wasn't an evolutionist.
No, but Locke would say we got our knowledge from experience, and that would seem to me quite an adequate guide in this matter.
Well, the way that he approaches experience is assuming that we simply pile up a number of different impressions, and from that, we are able to draw conclusions. I would challenge Locke's particular epistemology, saying that I don't think his tabula rasa approach accounts for the necessity of reason, the necessity of moral law, but I don't think he saw it because he was operating in a certain way in which he assumed certain cultural capital.
Well, we might have to agree to disagree on this, Michael, but I'll submit to you that you appeal to experience just as everybody else does. And that we could derive from our common experience an adequate notion of what constitutes at least apparent self. Without that, the argument doesn't get off the ground. Otherwise, it's simply trading one assertion for another. That God exists for the assertion that God does not exist, rather than arguing about the significance of some phenomenon.
But we have to go back to the way that we start the question, or the way that we start the problem. The beginning of the problem starts with saying that evil exists. For your position to hold, you have to say that we directly experience evil as it is without any sort of cognitive reflection on it to define it. We just experience it, and then that mere experience of it allows us to map that experience onto other experiences. But what I'm challenging is the very idea that I can just simply experience pain, and thus the experience of that pain is itself evil. That's the reason why
I would never hold that the experience of pain is inherently evil. That's obviously false. I went to my dentist yesterday, and he caused me pain. By God, he caused me pain. And before he did it, he said he was going to do it, which I appreciated. But, you know, he did it for my good, and I could understand that.
And I'm very glad that you brought up that example, because it's an excellent counterfactual example for the argument that you're making. Because if, in fact, I can experience the pain of having my tooth drilled, that experience is not adequate as a definition for evil.
Oh, I agree, absolutely. Pain is not, the evil is not just pain.
There's
Evil
a
is suffering. And what is apparently pointless suffering is suffering for which there seems to be no morally sufficient reason why it takes place. And there are plenty of instances of this which are evident to everyone, that there's no obvious or apparent morally sufficient reason for it to occur. That's the problem that upsets the non-theist.
We have questions.
Yes.
Ms. Combs,
By the
sorry.
way.
Just before you start, that's a great point. I just want to say this. That's a great point, and I'd like to reply to it. I'm just putting the note there on that. And then please go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, please.
I can wait.
You have the floor.
I guess I have a question for you. So if we, I guess, like Socrates tried to, got together and discussed a definition of evil, and we came up with a logically sound definition of evil that we all agreed all the propositions were, all the props followed, all of them were true, so we came up with a logically consistent definition of evil. If we were right, would, by your viewpoint, then, we only be right because of the grace of God? The logic of the argument would have nothing to do with it?
That's an excellent question. And I want to actually take that point that you made and build it out a little bit, if I might. Consider what you said, that we all get together and we think, we brainstorm, we have maybe a whiteboard, and we come up with a number of different options, and we decide, well, what do we want evil to be? And we think that through, and we think, okay, yes, this is what we think evil should be. And then we're careful in the way that we formulate it, so we make it logically consistent. Well, if we do that, the mere consistency of the description doesn't mean that that actually is what logic is, or excuse me, what evil is. For instance, if I want to define a particular make of car, Toyota, and we get together and with a bunch of other people, and we just brainstorm what we think it might be a great idea to have a Toyota be like, and then we, through our coming up with this idea, we make it logically consistent, and then we say, okay, this is this consistent definition of what a Toyota is. The consistency of that definition doesn't mean that it actually will be describing a Toyota.
That's why I would argue that propositions being true are important. That the propositions are true and that they logically follow.
Okay, but if they are true, this is,
Yeah.
the next point is, if they're true, we have to ask the question, how do we know that they're true? How do we know
Let
that?
it be by any means that you have available. I mean, why push the argument into a question about epistemology? I mean, just let it be that we know they're true. How can we know anything's true?
But in this particular case, if we're going to define what evil is, we're talking about a certain thing, us being able to define that this particular thing is
Okay,
evil.
let's take the
This is
case. I'll
what-
give you a case. I'll give you a real case.
Okay.
My sister-in-law. My sister-in-law is 66 years old. This is only one of my sister-in-laws. I have several. My sister-in-law has suffered a genetic mutation in her genome. This mutation, we don't know exactly where in the genome it took place. We don't know why it took place. We don't know when it took place. But it caused her to be born with a large tumor on the optic nerve of her left eye. It destroyed her eye, which was removed surgically before she was 1 year old. It destroyed parts of her prefrontal cortex. It destroyed parts of her temporal lobe. It destroyed parts of her parietal cortex. She was born with what became, as an adult, an IQ of 60. Her life has been severely curtailed as a consequence. She didn't do this deliberately. She didn't volunteer for it. Neither did her parents. Indeed, her parents are eaten up with guilt to this day. False guilt, indeed. This is an instance of apparently gratuitous suffering. Is there anybody here who would say otherwise? Now, it may not be actually gratuitous. Indeed, if theism is true, it cannot be actually gratuitous. There has to be a morally sufficient reason why that happened, if theism is true. Whatever that reason is not evident to anybody I've discussed the case with, and is certainly not evident to her. Is it a morally sufficient reason that could be evident? It seems to me there, an explanation is on.
If I may be the devil's advocate, so what?
Multiply the cases.
So what about this one?
Well, it appears, at least to some, that such cases, multiplied considerably, suggest that theism is unlikely to be true.
So?
That's the conclusion of the argument.
I'm being the devil's advocate, aren't you?
Well, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to respond to that, but I want to make sure that, go ahead.
So it seems like your position is ultimately going to be grounded on attempting to establish an absolute objective standard of morality, independent of whether or not we can know that. And a lot of this seems to revolve around epistemology. How can we come to know what this universal truth is? And the point would be that if there is a universal truth at all, it somehow requires God, right? That we couldn't have an objective standard that didn't stem from God in some way. And the rejection of the use for a problem, as far as I can tell, I want to say that the divine command theory doesn't work because there is an alternative that was ignored, and that would be quite simply that God's character is the objective universal standard here.
Yes.
And I would suggest about that a number of things, I guess. The first one is, I don't see why just because God has some particular character that becomes an objective, universal, absolute, unquestionable standard better than any other standard such as reason, which you proposed, experience, or any other kind of standard we could appeal to at
Sure.
all.
But all,
And one more, and then I'll let you respond, sorry.
okay.
It also seems to me that if God is going to be that standard, once you separate will, right, and that's what the divine command theory suggests, is it's God's will that makes it so. Once you take it away and you just say it's an objective truth about God's character, I don't see why you couldn't say it's an objective truth about anything, reality, the human condition, reason, but it's just a fact about those things instead of just a fact about God's character. Right? And once you take away will, I don't see how God is even necessary to define that as objective, because it seems like the only thing that makes it work is that God said so. It's like a lawmaker kind of thing. And that's why the only analogy that seems to work there with God would require will. Does that make sense?
Sure. I think I follow your question. Let me first reply to Dr. McClellan, and I'd like to reply to your point. I cannot, with the story that you told, I cannot, and this was a point that I made in my talk, explain to any individual person, well, this is the reason why God allowed that. I mean, I can't, because I'm not God. So I'm not going to give an answer to this, but I think the words of Christ are valuable here. He asked the question, was it this man's parents' sin or his own sin that he was born blind? And his disciples didn't have an answer, and the response that Christ gave was it was neither, but ultimately that God would be glorified. And the challenge that we face, and this is the reason why I posed my talk the way that I did, is that ultimately there's a destination to this. There's a direction that all of this is going. That God's created a world that is dangerous, a world that is corrupted because of sin, legitimately so, a world where there actually is natural evil. But one of the other points that I made is along the way, is God has made this world the way that He has. He's made it because this world is the best way to achieve the best of all possible worlds, which isn't this one. Right? Ultimately, there's something greater coming. And so the point that Dr. McClellan was making about it being a valid point, there's a reason why God is doing this. There's a reason why I've encountered suffering. You've encountered suffering. We've lost 3 children. My wife and I, we want to have 4 kids, and between each one of our children, we've lost pregnancies, and we believe that each life is special, and we don't understand why God's doing that. It's really hard, but I'm not trying to give this as a cheap try answer. I know there's a destination where this is going, and like Christ being in the garden, He's trying to understand, is there another way to do this? Not my will, but thine be done. That He understood that the way to approach this problem is recognizing that on the logical problem of evil, God is good. That on the evidential problem, God has a purpose for what He's doing, though He may not have told us all of it. And ultimately, why me? Well, that one's very personal. It's because God in His sovereignty has chosen that this is going to be my problem. I can't go to God and say, it's just some random reason that God has allowed us to lose 3 kids. Okay? I can't do that. But ultimately, I know that there is a reason and a purpose in it. And what happened with Christ, because He believed this, is instead of looking at the law and saying this is complicated and the times that I'm living in are so unjust and whatnot, He put it all together and said, I'm going to be faithful with what I know. And by doing this, He actually took all the law and all of our sin, and through being faithful, through suffering, save us all. Others, when we are willing to suffer and look at the suffering in this world as being redemptive, and the way we approach that suffering ultimately leads to redemption. We have to look at it with a certain purpose in mind. And whether we choose to interpret it purposeless or without purpose, my point is that that's a choice. That's a choice. And it's actually the more consistent, epistemologically reliable choice to recognize that evil still has to have a standard. I can't make up the standard for evil. I can't collect a bunch of experiences together and say this is evil. If I'm going to point to there being real objective evil in the world, then at the same time, that's testimony that the grace of God is working done. So that's the first answer. The second one is regarding necessity. I don't want to burn up all of our time, so I'll just say this quickly. The case that I'm making is not that there's just this abstract idea of God's character, and therefore, because God has a certain character, then that makes everything okay. That's part of a story. That's part of a full account. And the way that Collender talks about this, the way he explains it, is that all of the different beliefs within the Christian faith are not built from a foundation up. They are a bunch of different beliefs that can be argued for and defended epistemologically, but they're all interconnected. So when someone is making a particular point about the character of God, that's going to be connected to a number of other different issues. So when someone abstractly comes up with divine command theory and what the conclusions of that are, my question is going to be, on what basis do you, or does anyone, make the case that just because the will of God is such and such, that therefore necessitates all these things? Where do you actually assign necessity to be able to define the categories, to be able to talk about this is how this works and this is how that works? From a Christian worldview, and this is just a matter of explaining theology, I can talk about how all of those things are connected because I have a data set. When we start to just speculate and say, well, because of the abstract notion of will, that the abstract notion of will necessitates the abstract notion of this relationship between a command and so on, we're doing the same sort of thing that I'm arguing we're doing with the problem of evil when we just make up a standard. And we're just grabbing these things and kind of throwing them together.
I just think your story is a good one, and I think a lot of people have family members that but why not apply that to more area, just that specific life? For instance, Jesus' life. He did not want to go through all that things after the cross. He asked the Father, if it should be so, take this cup from me. This I can see how torturous and all the stuff that I'm going to go through, and I deserve none of it. Because he lived a perfect life. So I deserve none of it. I've done everything he asked me. If you can take it from me, please do. But, nevertheless, your will be done, not mine. And so it was the ultimate sacrifice. So his suffering, in other words, did he choose his suffering? No, he did not. So he was in the same scenario as the story you just displayed to me. Why? So he chose to do the Father's will. That is why he wanted to be obedient, respectful, and to the Father. And he knows the big picture here is more important than himself. So he sacrificed himself. Yes. So my question would be, why are you casting him aside when he actually was God himself, the man? Going through that.
Well, that's a larger issue than the one before us today. Certainly, certain forms of the problem of evil are one reason not to do it. I think my most strategic objection to Michael's position is that he seems to have made the problem a non-starter, one that doesn't get a grip on the theist law. It's indeed such that there really could be no objection to theism.
I don't think there's a problem
Without somehow presupposing the truth of the matter. And this seems to me simply begging the question.
Well, but if that is the case, there's nothing necessarily wrong with there being no way to assault theism. That's not an objection.
Well, yes, there is something wrong with it, because if it's true, then it must be possible for it to be mistaken. It's not possible for it to be a mistake, and it's most unlikely to be true.
So if it's the truth, that if it's true, it has to be possible to be mistaken. Is that truth itself possible to be mistaken?
Yeah, sure.
Think about that.
I have a problem with that. It's a recursive truth. I don't mind applying it to itself.
But if there are recursive truths, why, in that small area, why can't there be recursive truths in other areas?
I guess the burden of the evidence.
So if there in fact is evidence that there are recursive truths out there, and if in fact those recursive truths would demonstrate that the Christian faith is true, and that the problem of evil is a non-starter, that's not necessarily a problem, is it?
Sorry, I don't follow you, Mike.
Yes.
Would I be off topic here if I said that evil must exist to have free will, and because evil exists, it gives me an opportunity to further my salvation?
Well, it's not clear to me that evil has to exist in order to have free will.
I'm not choice.
Well, if having a choice is enough to have free will, you could have a choice between goods. And this does happen to us after all from time to time.
Well, good is good, period. I mean, there's no less good or more good.
Sure there is.
I think it would depend on the good, right?
Steak or burger?
It would depend on the nature of the good, right?
It depends on what I define as good. If I define God as good, is there a lesser good or a greater good?
Well, it would be good for me to have a drink of cold water here shortly, but it's a lot less than some other goods that
I don't mean it in that respect. I
Yeah.
mean it's good in itself.
But I do mean in that respect that it's possible to have plenty of choice without having evil.
And to, on this point, I'd like to support Richard regarding the comparative goods. Jesus makes a number of arguments where he says, is it better to do this or to do this? And this recognition of different kinds of goods or different kinds of evil, I think it's important to recognize those distinctions. That at least if we're considering free will abstractly, and we want to remove morality from the table completely, and say, well, can I live in a hedonic paradise where I get to choose chocolate or something really neat? You know, I mean, God just wanted to have pistachio. So chocolate or pistachio ice cream, right? We both would probably do the pistachio ice cream, but in that situation, you know, that could be the case. But in fact, it is the case that, well, I would argue that God made a world where we could have moral choice. And I think that's probably what you're arguing, right? Is that
Well, it's not an argument, it's a question.
Sure. Well, I think once again, that in order to have moral and significant choices, it's not strictly necessary to have evil. Because otherwise, at least according to all the major versions of classical theism, after all, there will come a time when those are the only choices we have. Morally significant choices among goods.
And in affirmation of what Richard is saying, one of the points of adjudication between his position and mine is I would argue that there's a certain way in which we're getting there. And the way in which we're getting there is involving our choice to choose that world rather than just having it given to us.
I guess I'll make one more statement. We're pushing.
We're getting close to,
in terms of
yeah.
time, but, I don't think the matter between the theists or non-theists concerning evil or indeed any other argument that cuts through the issue of whether God exists as described in these positions is simply a matter of choice. I think these arguments and their significance press themselves upon us. Press themselves upon us in the light of our experience. They press themselves upon us in terms of their inner logic, in terms of their logical implications and the like of that.
And I agree.
I don't think it's just a question of choice. I don't think I've chosen the worldview that I hold. It has pressed itself upon me.
Yeah. At that point,
Oh, thank you. One good man.
Michael, I have a question over there.
My colleague, Dr.
No, Dr. Collender, thanks a million. The only thing that I would maybe follow that last comment up from Dr. McClellan is to suggest that there was a temptation for you to take this issue off the table. And the problem for me with that is that then the issue of the existence of God becomes divorced from experience and divorced from the problems that press human condition. So once we let the problem of the existence of evil into the discussion, it's going to change our understanding of what God might be like. And I don't know, do you see that as a possible problem? If the issue becomes purely about God's existence, then the danger is we will say, what kind of God are we going to be talking about?
Well, this may have been the point you were trying to get me to see a few minutes ago. You kept pushing me from giving you the And this is one, I think Dan is right, this is one difference that it makes. And indeed, exactly how one poses the argument, exactly how one poses the challenge, does, I think, indeed condition the way in which we understand the nature of God, or the alleged nature of God, perhaps I should say.
And I would suggest that this is going to push the Greek conception of, even the Platonic conception of God in a strong way. And so there's a live issue between Buddhism and Christianity that the question of evil poses that makes those both viable options. You know, that some conceptions of Greek religion, it isn't.
Sure. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm presenting this talk is that I'm thinking through that very question of Buddhist and Christian dialogue. So I didn't tell you all that, but that's in my own research. That's one of the things that I'm working on. But that is at the core of why I wanted to present this. So, but in terms of the question you're asking, I would like to make a distinction between the serious philosophical problem with even beginning the problem of evil, which is what I've been arguing for here today. But because God actually is the standard by which we measure evil, it immediately creates an existential crisis for us, I would argue, where we have to ask the question, we're provoked to ask the question, God, why me in this particular situation? Why is it that family members that I know are suffering? And I'm trying intentionally to face that boldly and encourage all of us and I'm arguing for this as a Christian theist, that I think we need to face that, but then we have a choice of how we're going to deal with that. Which narrative are we going to choose in the way that we approach that? What I'm suggesting is if you go the other side and say, I'm going to choose that this is purposeless, I'm going to choose this, then what you actually lose, and for some reason it turned off here, but like Richard Dawkins, you actually lose evil. You lose the very thing that started the problem, which turns the problem of evil into a very difficult thing for us. Because if I recognize evil, then I'm confronted with this relationship with a God who really does love me, but there's something greater happening in the world, and I'm being invited into that work. But it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be tough. But I'm suggesting that we all need to do this. We need to face this in part, as I was talking about, it's at the core of a loving community. And if we had more time, I would love to go through and talk about, or work through how this relates to just institutions and the cultivation of just institutions, and how we love one another within institutions. But I think the point you're getting at is so important, and it's really at the core of this being a lived philosophical problem. You can't be neutral as you confront this.
Well, thanks to everyone for their patience. Let's thank our speakers.